Hello, ambassadors and fellow Israel travelers. I'm Dale Wells, and I welcome you to our ongoing study of the locations we plan to visit when we go to Israel in April 2022, just 4 months away. Maybe you were unable to attend class this week, or unable to see the slides on Zoom, or maybe you just want to review the material again or even share it with someone else. Whatever brings you here, welcome. If you like what you see, let me know by tapping the thumbs up link below. Also, if you tap the red subscribe link below, you'll be notified whenever I post new videos to this channel. In recent weeks, we've talked about some of my favorite places. We talked about Capernaum just before Thanksgiving. Of all the places we'll visit, Capernaum has got to be my favorite. If I could have someone drop me off for a week without a car anywhere in Israel, then come pick me up at the end of the week, I'd have them drop me off at Capernaum. Jesus spent about 2/3 of his entire ministry in and around Capernaum. In fact, if you were to map out a circle with a radius of 5 miles centered on Capernaum, you'd take in the locations where Jesus preached most of his sermons, told most of his parables, and performed most of his miracles. The next week, right after Thanksgiving, we talked about Chorazin and Bethsaida. Together with Capernaum, they form a location that writers refer to as the evangelical triangle: Capernaum, Chorazin, and Bethsaida. But as we saw in that week when we talked about those two other cities, Chorazin and Bethsaida, Jesus didn't have good things to say about them. As a matter of fact, he linked those three cities together, Capernaum, Chorazin, and Bethsaida, in a way of condemning them because of their lack of faith and repentance. Last week we weren't able to meet because of Serve Weekend, and I hope you all participated in that. But I did a lesson and put it online for you. Hope you had a chance to look at it. We talked about Magdala and actually several other locations on the western side of the Sea of Galilee that are of note. Most of them have some kind of connection to Jesus' ministry. And I think they're really significant, and I hope you had a chance to look at that video. If you haven't, maybe you'll go back and do it now. Today we're moving south of the Sea of Galilee, and we're talking about another one of my favorites, Beth Shean, otherwise known as Scythopolis. The photo I chose for the cover of December's booklet is a look down the main street of Beth Shean. Of the 10 cities that made up the Decapolis, Beth Shean was the capital, and it is the best example of a first-century Roman city that we'll see in Israel. But it's also a city with some Old Testament overtones. Beth Shean is located 17 miles south of the Sea of Galilee. If you'll notice, it's at the junction of the Jezreel Valley, the Harod extension, and the Jordan Valley. Now, you remember when we talked about Mount Carmel and we talked about Megiddo? I made a point of saying that the Jezreel Valley is the place where more battles have been fought in history than any other location on the globe. And it's also the background for the picture of Armageddon that we see in the book of Revelation. But trying to take away some of the superstition about the valley, I wanted to point out that the Jezreel Valley is where God's enemies in the Old Testament died. And one of the big examples of that is Saul, the king of Israel, that we're going to talk about today as we look at Beth Shean. But if you notice, the Jezreel Valley looks like an arrowhead shaped headed northwest. And the shaft of the arrow is the Harod Valley. Well, right at the mouth of the Harod Valley, where it connects with the Jordan Valley, is where Beth Shean is located. And so it's got accessibility to water supplies and travel routes, and it's really one of the best located sites in the entire country. I have a video about Beth Shean. It's about an 8-minute video, but I think you'll really enjoy it. It's done by Dr. John Delancey of Biblical Israel Ministries and Tours. And there's the website.
The ancient city of Beth Shean, or Scythopolis as it was called in the Roman period, is certainly one of Israel's most impressive archaeological sites. It's been thoroughly excavated, as you see, the Roman section of it, and what we're going to do is we're going to walk around these Roman ruins and then climb that green hill called an archaeological tell, or an ancient mound. But as we walk around this Roman city, let's start out with the bathhouses. There are three parts of a Roman bathhouse: a frigidarium, a tepidarium, and a caladarium. Now, hot air would have been blown underneath the floor, supported by these small pillars, with the hot air being generated from a fire outside of this building. In fact, here is the opening to where the hot air would have been forced into this particular room, underneath that archway there and underneath the floor of the caladarium. Besides the bathhouse, a colonnaded street is also quite impressive here at Beth Shean, or Scythopolis. You can see the pillars, of course, reconstructed now, and the stone street. There would have been a channel underneath the middle of this street, with some original stones of the street still visible today. The pillars would have stood high here at this Roman city. Dionysus was one of the Roman gods honored here. Here is a capital with the picture or an image of this Roman god. The middle channel, the drainage channel underneath this street. This street would have been used by chariots, so you can understand that the stones were positioned in a sideway orientation so that the chariot wheels would not get stuck in the grooves. Pedestrians had a mosaic walkway or sidewalk. Look how impressive it is today. The small mosaics were made with tesserae, a term defining the small cubed-like stones used in mosaic. And speaking of mosaics, in some of these side shops, some beautiful remnants of mosaics, restored of course, but you can see how colorful they are. These mosaics were not painted, but they represented the color of the stone itself. All kinds of figures and images used. Now there are tall pillars, and then there are massive pillars, such as these. In 749 AD, all of these pillars came down with the earthquake that literally brought an end to the city. This massive pillar represents that earthquake. So as we make our way around this Roman city, let's take a few more steps on the Roman street, and we'll walk up 190 steps to the top part of the site, or the Old Testament section of Beth Shean. Beth Shean is mentioned in 1 Samuel 31. The body of Saul was hung on the walls of ancient Beth Shean. So let's make a quick walk up to the top of the Old Testament site for a spectacular view of the Roman city below. We have already seen the bathhouse. We've walked the colonnaded street. The agora now is coming into the middle part of the image, the picture. And we'll zoom in to the theater once again. We'll, of course, stop by the theater on our way out of this city. You can see there is a higher level, an extra level, if you will, to the theater, holding probably 6,000 to 7,000 people. So it was a massive city, as you see, well excavated in the 80s and 90s primarily. But as we come down off the Tel, let's just make our way around the Agora, the marketplace, or the Forum, using the Roman term. And here we see still much of the Agora being exposed, and many other structures and buildings as well. Now, of course, every big Roman city had to have a public latrine, and this is one here. You tell me if this would have been a comfortable situation for people needing to use the restroom. And last but not least, we enter the theater. This is not a restored theater like the one at Caesarea. This is intact, and you can see how impressive it was. The acoustics in any theater are really good. Your voice carries easily to the top row. Speaking of the top row, a great perspective from this area of theater looking down to the stage area. This theater still has, in part, the scene, or the backdrop, still intact. Partially, I should say, but an impressive view from the top row of the theater today. As we leave the site, the back of the theater and the entrance is called vomitarium. What an impressive archaeological site of Beth Shean here along the Jordan Valley.
Here's an aerial view of Beth Shean from the northwest. The site of Beth Shean has been almost continuously settled from the Chalcolithic period to the present, and the fertility of the land and the abundance of water led the old Jewish sages of ancient times to say, if the Garden of Eden is in the land of Israel, then its gate is Beth Shean. It is the largest preserved Roman site in the country. The name means house of Shean, and Shean may have been a deity that was worshipped at the site. As you look from the northwest, you can see not only Beth Shean, but you can also see the Jordan River that is nearby, and the mountains of Gilead in the Transjordan region. Beth Shean is actually mentioned in many Egyptian records, dating back to the execration texts, the campaign records of Thutmose III, the Amarna letters, and the campaign records of Seti I. In the Old Testament, the city fell within Manasseh's tribal allotment, according to Joshua 17:11 and 1 Chronicles 7:29. And Joshua encouraged the people of Manasseh to take Beth Shean, but apparently they didn't, and the reason they didn't was because of their excuse that, well, these people have iron chariots, Joshua 17:16. Apparently they haven't learned, and sometimes I wonder if we've ever learned, that if God tells you to do something, He'll give you the ability to do it. But the fact of these iron chariots that were very formidable in the plains deterred the Manassites from taking the city. In the early days of the kingdom of Israel, after King Saul died, the Philistines captured his body and fastened it to the walls of the city. They put his armor in the temple of the Ashtoreths, And you can read about that in 1 Samuel chapter 31, verses 8 to 12. Well, a group of Israelites from Jabesh Gilead across the Jordan River snuck in by night, took the body of Saul and the bodies of his sons from the wall of Beth Shean, and came back to Jabesh and burned those bodies there. Again, here's a view of Beth Shean and the Harod Valley from the east. And looking at it from the east, you can see the Harod Valley that leads up to Mount Gilboa, where Saul was killed, and the hill of Morah that kind of form the framework of that shaft of the arrowhead leading into the Jezreel Valley. About a century and a half before Jesus, the Maccabean revolt had an interesting occurrence here in Beth Shean. Jonathan Maccabeus, who was the younger brother of Judas Maccabeus, agreed to have negotiations with the representatives of Antiochus IV Epiphanes, the Seleucid ruler of the area, but they enticed him into Beth Shean and they captured him. Well, after the Maccabean revolt, the followers of Judas Maccabeus and Jonathan and that entire group recaptured the city and gave the inhabitants the choice of converting to Judaism or leaving, and most of the people left. Well, that was about 100 years before Pompey and the Romans came and took over the entire area. In 63 BC, Pompey captured the city, rebuilt it, and it became the capital city of the Decapolis. In fact, if you remember, when we talked about Jesus casting the demons out of the swine at Cursey, and they ran down into the Sea of Galilee and were drowned, and then Jesus told that demoniac, "No, you can't come with me. Go back to your home, to your family, to your friends, and tell them what God has done for you." And he went into the region of the Decapolis. Well, the Decapolis was 10 Roman cities, and the capital of the Decapolis was Beth Shean. It's the only one of those cities that's on the west side of the Jordan. All of the rest of them were on the east side of the Jordan. Well, when Pompey took the city, he renamed it Scythopolis, which literally means city of the Scythians. And you wonder, well, who are the Scythians? Well, the Scythians were a group of people that came from the region we would know as southern Russia, and they were known especially for their brutality. In fact, they were regarded as basically very little better than wild beasts. You may recall that Paul makes reference to them in Colossians chapter 3, verse 11, when he says that in Christ there is no Jew, Greek and Jew, there is no circumcised and uncircumcised, there is no barbarian, Scythian, slave, or free, but Christ is all and in all. Now, there's no New Testament record of Jesus ever entering Scythopolis, but he certainly passed by it when he was going north or south along the Jordan River. The city was very clearly a pagan Gentile city. That's evidenced by the temples that have been discovered at the site. And as a result, the Jews who lived there became more Hellenistic in their framework than Jewish. And one clear evidence of this was that when the Jews revolted against Rome in the 60s AD, shortly after the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus, the Jews of Beth Shean sided with the Romans instead of with the Jews. As a matter of fact, during that Jewish revolt in 66 AD, Vespasian, the general, wintered at Scythopolis with his legions, the 5th and 10th legions. Here's a view of Beth Shean from the southwest, an aerial view. The city was destroyed by an earthquake on January 18, 749. And the result of that earthquake is all of those massive pillars that came crashing down, and the city was virtually abandoned after that. When we look at Beth Shean, there are some places that we'll pay particular attention to. We'll see the western bathhouse, and we'll go down Palladius Street. I'll explain the name in a little bit. We'll come to the intersection of Palladius and Sylvanus and Northern Street, right at the base of the Tel. And up on the Tel, we'll see some of the Old Testament and even pre-Old Testament ruins. If we get a chance to travel down Valley Street, we'll go across a Roman bridge. And we'll see some very interesting things there. The theater is a magnificent theater. And here's another view, an aerial view of Beth Shean from the south. When excavations began in earnest in the 1980s, only a single one of those columns was still standing. So what we see there has been largely a matter of archaeologists who have excavated and then reassembled things that they have found. When we get to the Tel, the top of that little mound, we'll find that they have discovered over 20 levels of occupation beginning back in the early Bronze Age. And there are some temples there from the Middle and Late Bronze Ages. During the Roman period, the Tel was apparently unoccupied, but the large city existed at the base of that hill. So what the Romans did, as they often did in their cities, is they built a temple at the top of the hill. And generally when you go to a Roman city, you'll see one large colonnaded street that heads toward an elevated area that's called an acropolis. And this is where the main Roman temple would be. And so it's likely that in the first century, people would go up and down the stairway that existed to the top of that Tel to worship at that Roman temple. Here's an aerial from the north looking over the Tel and down into the Roman city of Beth Shean. Here's a view from the northeast. And another view from the northeast. Now there are some major streets that we'll see when we go to Beth Shean. The street that's the main street is Palladius. It runs from where we enter the city all the way up to that Tel. And then there's Sylvanus Street that intersects with it. And then there's Northern Street that kind of goes at a 45-degree angle. But there are some places we'll see along the way that are going to be very interesting, like the Western Bathhouse and the Byzantine Sigma, and then the theater that's not in view in this particular picture. Here's a view of the excavations from looking up toward the Tel from the area where we enter the city. The theater is a magnificent structure. It has not been reconstructed like the one in Caesarea Maritima that we visit the first day that we go looking at sites in Israel. It was much bigger than it appears now. What we're seeing here is only the first of 3 levels of tiers. Well, what happened to the rest of the stones? Well, as I've told you before, people would find other uses for stones. And so when they would be building other buildings, they'd come to the ruins of Beth Shean and they would take away the limestone and they'd take away the things that they could use in other construction projects. Originally, this theater would seat 6,500 to 7,000 people. By comparison, the theater in Caesarea Maritima only seated about 3,500 people. So this is a massive example of what a theater looked like in a Roman city. And this is a view of the theater from the northeast. Notice those entrances and exits. They were called vomitorium. Now, you've probably heard, as I have, people who have said the Romans, they just partied all the time and they'd gorge themselves on food at their parties and then they'd go out to a vomitorium and throw up so they could come back and eat more food. Well, that's just a figment of imagination. A vomitorium was the entrance into or the exit out of a public building. And yes, it had to do with the idea of vomiting, but the idea was that as the crowds would leave the building, it's as though the building was vomiting them out. And so these are vomitorium out of or into the theater. So here's what the theater looks like from the inside. If you look at the far end, that long area behind the stage is called the Scene Franz. It was 3 stories high. The word scene means tent, and it's the word from which we get our English word scene. The idea is that this is where the actors would go to change costumes, to put on their new masks, because very often a single actor might portray several different roles in a particular play. The cavea was the seating area, and it was subdivided by a passageway that created an upper cavea and a lower cavea, and the orchestra was centered in the center of that cavea, or a choir if there was a choir being used. In this theater, there were 6 different vaults leading into the auditorium, and those are those vomitoria that I was telling you about. A large curtain of cloth or vellum could be placed over the theater to provide shade, and it was held up by tall wooden supports. From the focal point of the stage, a whisper can be heard in the final row of seats. There are all sorts of acoustical devices that the Romans used to make sound amplify in their theaters. They'd use empty jars to project the actor's voice. They'd have a projecting roof from the sine frons that would kind of project the actor's voice. The actors might wear tall shoes so that more people could see them, and they'd wear masks that were specially designed to amplify their voices. The seats of the theater were stepped up, kind of like we are accustomed to seeing in our theaters, in our arenas, and every seat had a projection that would go under the person in front so that a person could put his feet out without disturbing the person in front of him. And much like we see today, people brought their own cushions to the show with them. The theater at Beth Shean originally had 3 tiers of seating. The only one that still exists is the first tier. There still exists the basalt base for the second tier and the pilasters for the third tier. This is the way the theater looks from stage center. And sure enough, people who had a high social status got an opportunity to sit courtside, as it were. The more noble the person for whom who was sitting in this row, the closer to the center they got to sit. For very important people, sometimes the name might even be inscribed on the stone of their seat. This is another view of the sine frons, that elaborate backdrop that consisted of a row of granite and marble columns, richly decorated entablature adorned with plants and human figures and animals. And you can imagine how they could use curtains and draperies and things like that to create different scenes using that background. And then that sine frons would also turn to have its effect of amplifying the voices toward the seats. Here's a panorama of Beth Shean from the Tel. You can see Sylvanus Street, Palladius Street. You can see the theater in the distance and the western bathhouse in the distance, and the Byzantine Sigma that I'll tell you about a little bit later. Here's another view of Beth Shean from the Tel looking right down Palladius Street. Notice how the street, again, points right at the Tel, which is where the main Roman temple would have been. Here's a drone video of Palladius Street from above. Another view of the excavation. And yet another one. Here we're looking at the area called the Forum or the Agora. The Greek word is agora, the Latin word is forum. And that was the area where most of the business of the community took place. These are little shops all over the place where people would market their wares. When we get to Jerusalem, you'll see in the old city of Jerusalem what these might have looked like, as you'll have little shops that are carved into the walls right next to each other as you walk down the streets. But this is the Agora or the Forum, looking at all of those shops where probably most people bought and sold goods. Now, the first thing we'll probably visit when we get into Beth Shean is the Western Bathhouse. It's the largest bathhouse that's been excavated in Israel. It included an exercise room, swimming pools, the caladarium, and the tepidarium. And the function of the bathhouse in the Roman world was not primarily for cleaning. It was the place for socializing and business. Some bathhouses had separate sections for men and women. Others said men on certain days and women on other days. But a common order for people to use the bathhouse would be go to the exercise room first to warm up, and then the tepidarium, which is a place that's the place they're warming up, and then to the hot room, which is the caladarium, kind of like a sauna, and then finally take a quick dip in a pool in what's called the frigidarium, the smallest part of the bathhouse. The whole area of the bathhouse is surrounded by columns. This is a look at what would have been under the floor of the caladarium. Now, it's called caladarium from the word for heat. And the idea was this was a hot, heated room. And what they would do is they'd keep a fire going outside of the room, and they would force the heat from that fire into the area underneath the floor, where it would heat these limestone pillars. And as those limestone pillars heated up, they in turn heated the floor that they were sitting under. Now, you can imagine this is kind of like a sauna, and as the floor heats up and the walls heat up, naturally condensation forms on the roof. So the caladarium had a domed roof so that water wouldn't drip on the individuals inside. Here's the way a caladarium looks when it's not reconstructed like the one that we'll see. And this is the caladarium again in Beth Shean. Now you'll notice that closer to the wall, they have pillars that are bigger and made of brick, because obviously that's where more weight is going to be distributed. This is a part of the frigidarium, the cold bath, where the person who came out of the caladarium would take a quick dip before getting dressed again and going about his or her business. We'll see the Temple of Demeter and Kor, which is a 1st century temple. And of course, we'll see the public latrine. This latrine would seat about 40 people, and it was a major feature of town. Can you imagine trying to use these facilities? I mean, there's not even a wall between the stalls. And when you look at it, you'll see that there are some interesting features here. There are 2 channels, one behind and one in front of the stalls. The water was kept in a large tank above the room that was fed by an aquifer, and that water would flow through that larger channel beneath the toilets in order to flush the waste away. The channel in front of the toilet was used to carry water for washing hands. But the latrine at Beth Shean had all of the latest amenities. They typically had storage niches where the visitors could place their clothes and personal items while they took care of business. Now, one of the things I think is most interesting here is they had different shopping areas. I've already shown you pictures of the Agora where the common folk shopped. You know, that's where Target and Walmart and Kmart and those other places might be. This is more like the El Paseo region. This is called the Sigma, the Byzantine Sigma. And it's a semicircular marketplace on the west side of Palladius Street that was designed for more upscale merchandise. It was a luxurious commercial center. It included taverns and shops built as an area for the wealthier people to do their shopping. In fact, inside you'll see some of the mosaics. For example, this depiction of Tyche, the Greek goddess of fortune. And there's a closer view of Tyche. And in another one of the shops, there's an inscription that's in Greek in the mosaic there. Well, Beth Shean came to a crashing end, literally, on January 18, 749 AD, when an earthquake destroyed the city, and all the pillars fell in one direction. Here are pictures of the fallen column, and more pictures, and yet another of an arch that collapsed in the earthquake, and of the architrave that sat atop of an ark. But the main thing we'll see when we get there is this long, straight street called Palladius Street. Why is it called Palladius Street anyway? Well, Palladius was the name of the son of a governor who built this street. The street's made of black basalt, flagstones. They're arranged in a herringbone pattern, kind of a diagonal pattern, so that when chariots would go down one side or the other, they wouldn't get their wheels stuck in the ruts. And this particular street runs over a channel in the center that's also a drain, much like our modern streets. Here are the columns that sat alongside Palladius Street. A very common feature of Roman cities is that there's one central main street headed toward the Acropolis, and that street is generally lined with huge marble pillars. And those pillars are designed to give a picture of awe as a person walks through that city or rides through that city. Here's an excavated part of that drain down the center of the street that was covered over by that basalt paving. How do we know this street was called Palladius Street? Here's the inscription dedicating the street, and it's dedicated to Palladius Porphyrius, the son of the governor who built this street. That's what that Greek says. Beth Shean, the deity of the city, was Dionysus, the Greek god of wine. And alongside Palladius Street was a mosaic walkway where people could walk alongside that central street and not get in the way of chariots. Sylvanus Street, the other main street, was named after another son of that same governor. And in Sylvanus Street, which runs east and west, there were reflecting pools that reflected these pillars as you walked along the street. And that was designed to cool people down mentally. And it served an aesthetic purpose as the pillars were reflected in the shimmering water. Now, along the street, Sylvanus Street, there were also shops. These are upscale as compared to the ones in the Agora, or the Forum, but they're not quite the same quality as the ones over on El Paseo at the Sigma. So, even back in the 1st century, they had differences in where different people shopped. Here are pictures of the entrances into the Sylvanus Street shops. And another picture of the Sylvanus Street shops, including an archway leading into the Forum, the Agora. And here's what's left of the reflecting pools. Can you imagine how beautiful that would have been to walk along Sylvanus Street and see those reflections of those pillars shimmering in the water? Here's a view walking down Sylvanus Street toward Palladius Street. And a doorway with a Greek inscription. And then just before you get to Palladius Street, there's a nymphaeum where, of course, the Romans got to remember their nymphs, those females that cavorted with their gods. Here's Sylvanus Street nymphaeum with the columns that fell in that earthquake. And right at the corner where Palladius Street and Sylvanus Street come together is a monumental Roman temple, probably a temple to Dionysus. Here's a view of that corner from the north, and a closer look at that Roman temple. You had to pass by it if you went to the main entrance of the Forum. And there are the steps going up into that temple, which was probably a temple of Dionysus. Now, I've mentioned Palladius Street, I've mentioned Sylvanus Street. This is that street that runs diagonal where they come together. It's called Northern Street. And there are a lot of excavations that have gone on and are still going on there. But the biblical site of Beth Shean is really this Tel, this mountain. And there are a number of ancient ruins there that are interesting. Of course, there's a Roman temple that would have been a part of what directed Palladius Street. It was the place where the Acropolis of the Romans would have been. But going back way before that, there's an Egyptian governor's residence, there's an Israelite fortress, there are some early bronze and late bronze temples that have been excavated. The Tel is about 40 feet higher than the hill that it was originally built on. So there was a hill there before, but it just got bigger and bigger and bigger as civilization moved from level to level. Here's an aerial of the Tel from the west. Another view of it from the southeast and from the northwest, where you can see the ruins of the Roman temple, and before that the late bronze temples and the Egyptian governor's residence. Tel Beth Shean has been excavated primarily by Amichai Mazar of the Hebrew University, and he did most of his work there from 1989 to 1996. Now, you may have heard the name Mazar before. I've mentioned Eilat Mazar, who was Amichai's cousin, and she is the one who was able to locate the city of David. They used to famously say of her, she just passed away, I think, back in June of this year. They used to famously say of her that she did her archaeology with a Bible in one hand and a spade in the other. And that's exactly how she found the city of David. She looked in the Bible, said this is where it is, and they dug there, and sure enough, that's where it was. But they are both grandchildren of one of the foremost Israeli archaeologists of centuries, and that is Benjamin Mazar. And so this is a family that's really made their lives out of digging up the history of Israel. Well, some of the discoveries on the Tel there in Beth Shean are the Middle Bronze Wall, a huge oval pit, and it's got walls around it. They found a number of baby burials and storage jars in that Middle Bronze area, which is a common feature of the time. Here's a late bronze Canaanite temple, the ruins of it. And here's another picture of the ruins of a late bronze Canaanite temple. And this looks at the late bronze temple and the remains of the Roman temple at the crest of the mountain. Here's a view looking at the excavations and across them over toward the Jordan Rift Valley and the mountains of the Jordan region past that. Here are remains of early Bronze area structures and a better view of those early Bronze remains. Here is a mud brick wall that goes as a part of an Israelite fortress dating back to the time of David and Solomon in the early Iron Age. And here is the Israelite fortress again from another view. Going back before the time the Israelites were building structures here, here's the Egyptian governor's residence that existed during the late Bronze period before the Iron Age. You can tell by looking at this that the Egyptians enjoyed a high standard of living, and they found a lot of indicia of that when they've excavated this area. They found a lot of thin gold leaves that were used to plate objects, and they found a golden ram's head, and they found furniture and golden earrings and silver rings. The walls of the Egyptian governor's residence were built on basalt stone foundations and has been partly reconstructed, as you can see here. Here's the lintel at the entrance to the Egyptian governor's residence. Here's a monumental inscription erected at Beth Shean to commemorate Seti I's conquest of the city in about 1290 BC. And here's a statue of Ramesses III. If we have a chance to go down Valley Street, we'll come across a Roman bridge, which would be worth seeing, but I don't know that we'll have time to visit it. This is what it looks like. And there's also an amphitheater there at Beth Shean. That amphitheater, as you may remember when we talked about it in looking at Caesarea, it was called the Hippodrome there. But the amphitheater was designed for primarily race-type activities, maybe gladiatorial spectacles, where people fought against each other, and you had people seated all the way around the arena. The external measurements of the amphitheater in this case are 332 feet by 218 feet. So it's a pretty substantial structure. And here's another view of it, and a panorama of it. It held about 6,000 spectators. Here's the entrance into the arena, and another view of the walls around the arena, and a picture of the staircase leading up to upper level seating. So that's our view of Beth Shean. I hope it's been a blessing to you. I think you will really enjoy looking at Beth Shean, both the Roman city below and the Tel above. And I hope that this kind of whets your appetite for that visit. Next week we'll talk about the Jordan River. In the meantime, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Amen.